Hi, everybody. Hi, welcome. Wow, it's so great to see everybody here and so many familiar faces for this truly incredible event. I'm just going to do a brief note of welcome. So, welcome to the Lenfest Center at the Arts. For the Arts at Columbia University School of Arts. I'm Chloé Cooper Jones, an associate professor of writing at Columbia. And I want to just thank you for all joining us for tonight's conversation, which we've titled Crisis and Desire, to celebrate the publication of three truly remarkable, amazing, and very for sale books by Eliza Barry Callahan, and The Hearing Test by Eliza Barry Callahan, Dead Weight by Emmeline Clein, and Splinters, Another Kind of Love Story by Leslie Jamison. A brief land acknowledgement. Columbia University recognizes Manhattan as part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger people. And tonight's event is part of the School of Arts Spring 2024 season of public programs and engagement. And you can find out more about upcoming events at arts.columbia.edu. I want to thank Sarah Cole, our interim dean of Columbia University School of the Arts, Parr Professor of English and Comparative Literature, and our co-presenters, School of the Arts Writing Program and Book Culture, who are selling books tonight. And also Gavin, I don't know where Gavin went. Maybe there. Gavin, who keeps all the trains running on time and is just an amazing organizer and helps me process emails and just does so much to make events like this happen and deserves our deep gratitude. So tonight we're going to hear brief readings from Emmeline, Eliza, and Leslie, followed by a conversation. And then also a Q&A where you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. And then immediately following, they'd be happy to sign any books for you as well. So Eliza Barry Callahan, she'll read first for us, is a writer, artist, filmmaker, and musician from New York City. Her debut novel, The Hearing Test, was published in March 2024 via Catapult. Her criticism and fiction have been published in Freeze, Bomb, The Believer, and a lot of other places that she crossed out right before this event that she doesn't want me to read, so I won't. She's a New York Foundation of the Arts Fellow and received her MFA here at Columbia University. Emmeline Clein's writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Yale Review, The Nation, Smithsonian, Berlin Quarterly, Vice, BuzzFeed, Catapult, and Anti-Gravity, among other places. Her chapbook, Toxic, was published by Choo Choo Press in 2022. She received her MFA here at Columbia University, and she lives in New York. Leslie Jamison is an associate professor of writing and the concentration head of the nonfiction writing program here at Columbia. She is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Recovering, The Empathy Exams, and most recently, Splinters, as well as a collection of essays, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, a finalist for the Penn Diamonstein Spiegel-Vogel Award, and the novel The Gin Closet, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She writes for numerous publications, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Harper's, and the New York Review of Books. She's also a tireless educator, a very supportive colleague, and I am going to briefly pass it over to Leslie so that she can properly introduce this wonderful event as well.
Thank you, Chloe, and thank you for so gamely and passionately offering to host our conversation. You are one of the people in this world who I most love talking to, so I'm looking forward to talking to you about these books that I love so much tonight. I thought so lovely to see all of you here, many of you familiar and beloved people who I know from this world that we share here at Columbia. I thought I would just say a few words about kind of why, how I conceived of this evening when Gavin approached me a while back and asked whether it would be fun to put something together. And I said, yes, it would be. And I wanted, it basically all comes down to the fact that Eliza and Emmeline and I put out books in very close succession this spring, and that made me start to fantasize about what it would be like to talk about those books together. But I thought to begin, I would tell you a little bit of the story of how we came to know each other and set the scene, as it were. In the fall of 2020, we were 6 months into the pandemic and embarking on a full year of Zoom classes, all struggling in our separate ways with figuring out how to come together in new ways on new terms. That fall, it felt like a gift from the universe that I got to teach one of the most extraordinary thesis workshops of my entire career. Choosing favorite classes is bad practice, and I don't do it, but this one was pretty good. A group of talented, razor-sharp, deeply funny, deeply compassionate women. It wasn't necessary that we all be women, but I don't think it hurt either. We all brought such fullness of heart and mind and spirit to this Zoom classroom that it became a space that honestly held more community, more closeness, and deeper conversation than I had ever thought a Zoom would be capable of holding. Everyone from that workshop holds a special place in my heart, and I've gotten to watch so many of those brilliant women keep producing incredible work, as well as sustaining their deep bonds with each other. But two of the women from that workshop are here with me tonight, Emmeline and Eliza, who both put out books this spring, Dead Weight and The Hearing Test, that emerged from the thesis projects they were working on in that workshop. Over the course of that workshop back in fall 2020, we did something called studio visits, where one writer each week invited all the others into the studio of her computer. It was kind of, for me, vaguely inspired by the 80s movie Tron, where people actually got really small and got to crawl inside, literally inside of a computer. To me, thinking about the screen share function of Zoom in those terms was deeply exciting. I remember Emmeline taking us into the deep trenches of TikTok. Actually, I'm sure she spared us some of the deepest trenches, where people were swapping tales of their eating disorders and their survival. And I remember Eliza showing us screenshots from the Google walks through various German towns that she'd been taking as part of the process of writing her book. At the end of that workshop, we all gathered on a cold December day in Prospect Park, spread blankets on the ground, and shared fruit and pastries and watched for the albino squirrel that Eliza was always spotting in the trees. She has a sort of supernatural talent for bringing magical things close to her. And over the years since, as Eliza and Emmeline both turned their thesis projects into books, I felt that bliss that, for me, does not resemble or compare to any other. Watching words I've loved and believed in reach the larger world. Earlier today, I went back to read the letters that I had written Eliza and Emmeline during workshop, and I'm going to embarrass them briefly by reading a few passages. It feels like the kind of origin story of my particular relationship to these two incredible books. To Emmeline, I wrote, "So much that I love here, and not just because, as you know, I share so many of your fascinations with eating disorders and the various ways we are fascinated by them, the double-edged nature, triple-edged nature, quadruple-edged nature, infinitely edged nature of so many of these fascinations, fetishizing pathology even as we ostensibly lament it or sympathize with it, craving pathology even as we disdain it and disdain the impulse toward it in ourselves, unwittingly reifying and constructing it through various attempts to cure it." That was the beginning of my first letter, and this is the end of the last one I wrote her. The bottom line is that I'm endlessly compelled by your writing and your mind and your voice, and so deeply grateful we get to work together intensively on your project this term. Can't wait. We got to work together on it this term. Can't wait to keep talking about it in our final conference and beyond. And this conversation here tonight feels like the beyond, beyond, beyond of getting to talk about this work through the years. To Eliza, I wrote in my last letter, As ever, I felt myself nearly punch drunk with these pages, deeply spellbound by something in them, and fully convinced that I was encountering an authority in the voice, in the prose, in the details, and the glints of observation and insight that I wanted to surrender to absolutely, wanted to simply follow. It was like the authority of a song or a Siberian throat singer calling across the hills, rather than the authority of a strict school teacher. You don't want to question it. You just want to follow. The voice in these pages is droll and tender and proximate and surprising, full of deft strokes of detail and precise emotional observations, a knowing wit that takes stock of the absurdity of the world without deflating anything. Whole passages took my breath away, like this one. The whole flock was still in the trees singing, but her ears had refused the song. Loss is a process, she said, not a light switch. So what are we doing here tonight? When I realized that Emmeline and Eliza and I had books coming out around the same time as my own memoir, Splinters, I immediately started to imagine a conversation between the three of us, not only because I had been lucky enough to witness their projects early, not only because Splinters, my own book, is in part about teaching as a form of caregiving and reciprocal transformation, but because all three of our books seem to be about various forms of crisis: sudden deafness, lethally disordered eating, divorce and the splintering of family, and the ways that crisis opens us up to new forms of attention, new ways of seeing, knowing, and noticing, new forms of curiosity and care. Emmeline has subtitled her book Essays on Hunger and Harm, and I want to dig into both of those conditions tonight as they resonate across all three of our books. What does desire feel like? What does wanting feel like? What does curiosity feel like? What does solitude feel like? And what does company feel like? I also thought we could talk about teaching and learning and what happens inside and beyond classrooms that also becomes part of the creative process. And there is no one I would rather have these conversations with than Chloé Cooper Jones, my friend and colleague, the incoming director of our nonfiction program at Columbia, who writes so beautifully about all of these things: wanting, curiosity, pain, solitude, caregiving, in her own gorgeous book, Easy Beauty, and who is a transformative teacher herself. So to start off, we're going to hear just a brief reading from all three of our books, starting with Eliza.
Thank you, Leslie. When you have a teacher as generous as Leslie, you can delusionally believe you can write a book. That's what those letters do. Thank you. Okay, wait, I'm going to put this here. On August 29th, 2019, I was meant to travel to Venice to watch a lifelong friend get married, a small reception for just 10 people. The friend was marrying a Venetian. When I awoke that morning, I felt a deep drone in my right ear, accompanied by a sound I can best compare to a large piece of sheet metal being rocked, a perpetually rolling thunder. I moved from the bedroom to the living room in a controlled panic where my little black dog stood by the door and barked. It was just past the time for her morning walk. The bark, the first distinct external sound I had heard since waking, was distorted and distant. When I called out her name, I found my own voice sounded unfamiliar. The volume had been dialed up and the pitch had shifted. A few days earlier, I had been swimming in the Rockaways after a heavy summer rain, and I thought maybe the city water had taken hold. I had just moved into a one-room apartment with my little black dog. My landlord, I learned, was a painter known for figurative works, Latin with symbolic meaning. A fan of Pierre Bernard, her subject was primarily herself, and the paintings took form as conventional self-portraits and fragmented close-ups, oil on linen. A critic had compared them to the short stories of Chekhov. It seemed this critic was also a personal friend. The landlord had lived in the apartment 35 years ago, had used it as a studio for 5 years, and hadn't set foot inside the place for 10. She had employed a man, a documentary film editor, to look after it, liaise with the tenants, and collect the rent. She had neither the time nor the energy for leaks, locksmiths, or tired drains. The editor, a previous tenant himself, told me that he hoped to one day buy the place should the painter change her mind and finally decide to sell. When we met in front of the building to sign the necessary documents, he told me that even though I had signed the lease and was moving in the following week, the landlord wanted to interview me out of curiosity. She had a busy schedule and wouldn't be available until after I moved in. We met in the small park 2 blocks from the apartment 2 weeks later. The landlord asked me if there was still a fireplace in the 1-room apartment, and I found it funny that she was asking me this about her own home. I told her I did not recall a fireplace. Someone must have taken it away or covered it up, she said with heavy suspicion. In the interview, she did not ask me any questions about myself. She did say the happiest times were spent there in the apartment before she had children, and noted that it was good that I was small like she was. I would be able to stand up straight in the shower without issue. She suggested doing dishes in the shower, too, which sat behind a bifold door in the kitchen just next to the apartment's only sink. The water pressure is more determined in the shower, she said, and you can get 2 things done at once. She told me that the southern light that came in was special because it was muted perfectly by the way the building stood at different angles and heights in the back courtyard. Direct light is a real hassle, she said. She said the light in the apartment was very androgynous. The courtyard on which the apartment's 2 windows looked out was the courtyard from Rear Window, she told me. Hitchcock had shot footage from the roof and other surrounding buildings in order to construct his set, a near-perfect replica. It's very funny, she said. When she lived in the apartment, the super had actually murdered a tenant. I said the super seemed nice. She said he was new. She added that the view from our window was the exact view that the invalid had from his window in the film. She said our like it was our apartment, like we lived there together. The thing is, she said, our same view is sitting there in Hollywood on Melrose Avenue, somewhere on the Paramount lot, covered in a cape of dust. She said this was fitting because she was someone who always made sure to have 2 of everything she liked, just in case. She told me she had 2 of the same shirt she was wearing right then. It's as if this block, this courtyard, were a smear of wet ink on paper that had been folded in half. That's how it had gotten to the other side, to California. This country is the real Rorschach test, and in the middle, it's just a lot of illegible darkness. You'll see, all we can do is read the edges. She said that our apartment on the Hollywood set actually had plumbing, probably better than ours here. In the snow, I often thought our courtyard was the model for the real thing, she said, not the other way around. And sometimes I wondered if the sun was actually just 1,000 lights on a dimmer. In the first weeks of hearing loss, I began talking to myself out loud to make sure I had retained the hearing I had left. This was a useless exercise, but I carried on with it anyway. I would say things like hello at random intervals, as though someone had knocked at the door. My voice would always be the one thing I could hear, even if everything else had been shut out. But I could hear my voice more clearly now, and even when I wasn't speaking, my thoughts felt somehow louder. I had become nearer to myself. I'll stop there.
Okay. Hi. That was beautiful, Eliza. Guess I'm just going to start. The summer after 7th grade, I became a bat mitzvah girl and an oxymoron. According to the Torah, my bat mitzvah made me a woman, but in 2007 suburbia, real adults were always asking me how it felt to be a bat mitzvah girl, leaving me wondering how I could be a woman while still a girl. On the cusp, peering over a cliff or stepping onto a stage. But that wasn't the only liminal label I received that year, and the biblical commandments weren't the only ones I was studying. The year I spent practicing my Torah portion was also the year I first oriented my life around losing weight, and the year I first heard a doctor say the words eating disorder, though he didn't say the words I am ashamed to admit I desperately wanted to hear him say, anorexia nervosa. The words he chose instead were eating disorder not otherwise specified, This is the diagnosis you get if you have symptoms of anorexia or bulimia but are subclinical or subthreshold, considered not symptomatic enough or displaying symptoms of multiple disorders but not enough of any one. Often, as in my case, these patients are simply suffering from anorexia's behavioral, cognitive, and emotional symptoms but are not considered medically underweight enough to be deemed anorexic. I ended up in that doctor's office at the end of a year I'd spent struggling with food, a year in which I'd been bat mitzvahed, been ditched by my best friend, and joined Tumblr. I read the 10 Commandments, and then I read something called the Thin Commandments, and I believed back then, but I had doubts. About myself, about Anna, about God, about the girl who left me. Instead of investigating, I scrolled in the dark. Repetitive motion, left hand on the keyboard and right hand moving from the cereal box to my mouth. I brought a religious intensity to my rituals. I reblogged, I chewed, I hearted, I swallowed. Judaism teaches that reading is devotion, study sacred, so I sought out an education in the only realm that ever felt spiritual to me, whisper circles and chat rooms. On the internet, girls told me the commandments they lived by. I mouthed words and memorized. I found the marked page in the Tanakh and practiced my Torah portion, and then night fell and I logged on. I studied the screen, the poems about eating disorders and the food logs and the quotes from starlets who died young and thin, eating disorders and Judaism and girlhood, these mazes and matrices, spiritual planes on which you can be lost and found at the same time. The girls on Tumblr lived according to rules that involved food, but also feelings and a higher power. Things you can and can't eat and why. Judaism has rules like these too. Kashrut, a system of Byzantine bylaws bounding meals in words and prescriptions and guilt. My Torah portion was the story of the red heifer, a female cow used in a ritual purification ceremony. In order to be eligible to die to purify a Jew, she must be spotless, a single shade all over, and she must never have been pregnant, milked, or yoked. This is female purity. Smooth, sacrificial, untouched, hasn't worked a day in her life. When the same story is told in the Quran, Moses calls for a sacrificial red heifer, neither a calf nor immature, between two conditions. This, too, is part of purity. No longer a girl, not yet a woman, the perfect age to die sacrificially. I chanted the story in Hebrew, hungry. I was creating my own kashrut, a system of fasting and ritualistic rules cobbled together from magazines, diet books, blogs, eating disorder novels, and Google searches. I hadn't yet gotten my period or kissed anyone and wouldn't for years. No longer a girl, not yet a woman. It probably tasted tangy, knowledge, juice on her lips, dripping down her chin. Did she realize then? Overcome by the bittersweet spice crisp between her teeth, did she keep biting and chewing and swallowing until her hand was sticky and nothing but an apple core remained, seeds spilling onto the grass, the shame settling in? That what just happened, who was in charge, post-binge blur, the collision of humiliation and self-hatred, wondering whatever happened to your willpower? Gwen Shamblin-Lara, the creator of an incredibly popular Christian weight loss program that many former devotees have traced long-lasting eating disorders back to, calls Eve's original sin the cardinal instance of overeating. Hers is not the only Christianity-infused weight loss program, but one of a litany that includes books with titles like Slim for Him and More of Jesus, Less of Me. This trend is a logical bridge between full-scale fasting girl mystics and the modern anorexia devotee. Eve's ostensible gluttony is often posited as the sin that set the ball of human foibles rolling down the hill out of Eden, the gateway vice, in the words of one Christian website. Simone Weil believed vice and depravity are almost always, in their essence, attempts to eat beauty, to eat what we should only look at. Eve began it. If she caused humanity to be lost by eating the fruit, the opposite attitude, looking at the fruit without eating it, should be what is required to save it. For Simone, anorexic since her teens, this stance may have been both literal and metaphorical. She is advocating contemplation and attention, applying the division between looking and eating to human relationships. She argues that most people love others like cannibals for the emotional sustenance they offer. Instead, we must love the hunger in a human being, their desire for life, love, connection, and we must love all equally, loosing ourselves from our separate skins and slinking into the sea of humanity. According to much of the clinical literature on anorexia, a boundless need for intense human connection tortures the anorexic, who lacks a certain individuality, has difficulties in autonomous function and sense of personal identity, harboring instead a desperate desire to be part of a community. In an essay letter to Simone, the writer Nancy Houston wonders whether, having been constrained, you decide to wish only and always for constraint. Whether Simone detached from actual living relationships because she feared how deep her desire for them ran. I did this in my own anorexia-adjacent days, abandoned by friends and told I was too clingy, too prone to spilling and sweating emotions I should have kept inside. Eventually, I thought I'd just try emptying myself so there would be nothing to ooze out and discuss the people I wanted to love me. Simone wanted to love impersonally, to love everyone for the yawning caverns of yearning that made them human. Utterly pure good requires affliction. Aching emptiness transforms into receptivity. She wanted to understand people's pain, so she felt that she had to suffer as much as those who suffered most. She conflates nourishing the body with satiating emotional needs, casts starving oneself of both as a path to purified, ethereal morality. When we do not eat, our organism consumes its own flesh and transforms it into energy. It is the same with the soul. The eternal part consumes the mortal part and transforms it. The first sentiment sounds eerily like a diet book explaining how calorie deficits work, while the second applies that logic to the metaphysics of morality. This is a common theme in more modern anorexia narratives, this focus on physics and conceptions of ethics. An anorexic astrophysics student, the star of Sarah Gerard's novel Binary Star, calculates wavelengths and wonders about exploding suns. Her story ends in blackness and fire, her fate a black hole like the star that is the book's namesake, and her one obsession other than food. As the story hurtles into the hot dark, she becomes a vegan anarchist, channeling her anorexia into what she believes is a revolutionary altruism, saving animals and saving humanity's soul. But there are casualties, herself included. The thing about that mind-body binary is that severing the two is usually lethal.
So wonderful to hear you both read from those books. And I'm gonna take a little picture of this crowd because it makes me so happy. Okay. All right. I'm just gonna read a few minutes from Splinters, and then we'll start talking because that's really the heart of this evening. I guess the main thing you need to know to hear this bit is that Splinters it exists in 3 parts. They're called Milk, Smoke, and Fever. And each one begins with a small prose poem. I think of these as Google lyrics. They're composed of Google searches. So I'm going to read the first Google lyric and the first couple pages of the book. What is the robot owl that makes babies fall asleep? What is the doll with a heartbeat that makes babies fall asleep? What is the name of the $1,000 crib that does everything a mother does? Does the skin shelf above a C-section scar ever go away? Marina Abramovich had how many abortions? Why is the cold moon also called the morning moon? Is a flying ant always the queen trying to start a new colony? What makes the queen ant want to start a new colony? What is the average hourly rate for divorce lawyers in New York City? How will the wolf moon change my life? The baby and I arrived at our sublet with garbage bags full of shampoo and teething crackers, sleeves of instant oatmeal, zippered pajamas with little dangling feet. At a certain point, I had run out of suitcases. We had diapers patterned with drawings of scrambled eggs and bacon. Why put breakfast on diapers, I might have asked, if there had been another adult in the room. There was not. Outside, it was 19 degrees in the sun. For the next month, we were renting this railroad one-bedroom beside a firehouse. I'd brought raspberries and a travel crib, white Christmas lights to make the dim space glow. Next door, a fireman strutted toward his engine with a chainsaw in one hand and a box of Cheerios in the other. My baby tracked his every move. What was he doing with her cereal? It was only when I told my divorce lawyer she is 13 months old that my voice finally broke. As it turns out, divorce lawyers keep tissues in their offices just like therapists, only not as ready to hand. I know we've got them somewhere, she told me warily, rising from her swivel chair to search. As if to say, we aren't surprised by your tears, but it's not our job to manage them. If I cried for 5 minutes, it would cost me $50. Just over 13 months, I said, wanting to make it seem like we had stayed married longer than we actually had. Again and again, he told me, our baby is just 1 year old. My best friend said, better to get out now. It did not help to argue with him in my head. It only helped to hold the baby so close that the globe of her belly became the whole world. And even that, well, it cut both ways. Our sublet was long and dark. A friend called it our birth canal. It seemed to be owned by artists. It was not meant for a child. The coffee table was just a stylish slab of wood resting on cinder blocks. The biggest piece of art was a large white canvas that looked like a wall hanging on the wall. Sometimes the firemen next door ran their chainsaws for no good reason, but what did I know? Maybe there was a reason for everything. Amazingly, when I did my event in Washington, D.C. now a couple months ago, there was a fireman in my signing line who told me the reason that they were always running their chainsaws. I was like, I knew it. There's a reason for everything. To be discussed if you want, Chloe. Our nights were full of instant ramen and clementines. My fingers smelled like oranges all winter. Our rooms were lit by the liquid pulsing of red siren lights through the slatted blinds. The kitchen counters were streaked with trails of red velvet batter and little beige buttons of hardened pancake mix, the residue of throwing sugar at a problem. By day, my baby crouched among the heavy art books with her wooden maraca and smacked the translucent pages of a story about a pile of leaves. The willow, the birch, the stray mitten, the lost key, and at the very bottom, a tiny worm. My baby was gentle with her stuffed moose, nuzzling his patchy brown fur against her cheek. But with her wooden xylophone, she was an Old Testament god. It barely survived her music. I'm just going to read one last splinter. That's what I think of as these little blocks of prose, kind of shards of prose. But this one's about teaching, so I wanted to read it last. The first class I taught that semester of our separation, when my life consisted of sublet hunting, angry texts, and taking care of the baby, or else getting her to childcare, I arrived at class with my pulse loud against my temple, skittery from too much caffeine. My heart was a hive of bees in my chest. My students tucked their hair behind their ears and picked at their cuticles and took turns telling me what they wanted to write about. Labiaplasty, chronic pain, getting caught in an avalanche. They didn't know it, but they were all my children. It's like a little close to home to be saying, you're all my children. My beehive heart had enough love for all of them. Once you're finally out of a broken marriage, it feels like you're just dripping with love, or at least it felt that way to me, like it was a heap of bubble bath suds growing larger and larger all around me. I wanted to slather it across the whole world. That was me in my bathtub next to the fire station, me with my baby taking care of business in every room of our birth canal. She needed to take the spoons out of the spoon rack. She needed to take all the baby jeggings out of the baby jegging drawer. She needed to play her rainbow xylophone like it was a creature that had wronged her, like she was telling me, you better get on your knees, you better get on the floor and start listening. Watching her slam the meat of her tiny palms against the wooden slats, I almost turned to the phantom of her father beside me so we could watch her together, then caught myself. Would every moment of happiness carry this weight tucked inside of it? Okay.
Okay, now we'll talk. Wow, that was so amazing. That was so beautiful. And it was incredible. I feel like I've been living with your books, sort of preparing for this event for the last several weeks. And so to hear your voices and this incredible prose out loud is it's just revelatory, and I'm so grateful for it. I also am really grateful for your introduction, Leslie, that I thought was so beautiful. And I got quite emotional because so many of my students are in this room, and I'm new to Columbia. This is the end of my very first year teaching in the program, and I had this very powerful moment very early on where I looked around the room at my students, so many of them are here, and I had this moment where I was like, soon I get to buy your books. And it was like, I couldn't wait for that moment, and just, imagining myself in your position, very, very soon is like, it's just the best. So this is just, I'm just so honored to be a part of this. There's a bit of a challenge to navigate when you're asking questions about 3 really different books to 3 really different writers. I don't want to overgeneralize anything with big, broad questions, but I also want to see how we can sort of draw some specificity about your projects. I should have known that you would just write a bunch of questions for me in your intro. So, of course, we can talk about crisis and harm and desire and all these things as well. Maybe just talk about chainsaws first really quickly. That seems crucial to know. And then I'll get to my question.
Well, so I get it's a short answer, luckily, which is that I guess chainsaws can easily come like I've exhausted the limits of my chainsaw specific knowledge, but the teeth, the chain can easily come off the teeth. So you're sort of constantly, at least this fireman's take on it was like you're constantly checking to make sure it's still working. So you always have to be running them so that if you, in that moment when you really need it to work, you know that it's in like good working order.
But what are firemen doing a lot of chainsawing? I guess
I live next to a firehouse,
Do they have chainsaws?
I've always thought they're like sharpening a big knife. But that's, I guess, a chainsaw.
So they raise a similar question, which is like, what are they using the knife for, or what are they?
I guess they have to like get through the walls to like get to the person really fast to save them.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm satisfied with these answers, but
Chloe's a journalist, so this is good. This is good that you're.
I'm like, I need a few facts here, follow-up questions. Okay, so one thing I thought I'd try is to ask these questions is, I feel like very early on in all 3 of your books, there's a sentence that in some ways sort of frames the project, and I mean loosely frames the project of each book. And there was an amazing sort of feeling that I had that in these sort of framing or introductory sentences or sort of explications of goals, I felt like those sentences could actually apply to all 3 of these books. And so I want to ask, and I'll start with Eliza, if you don't mind. Here's one sentence from the end of Eliza's preface, and I wonder if you could talk about this sentence, how it sort of frames like the form, I think especially, of your book. And then if Emmeline and Leslie can think about how this sort of relates to their work as well. And then I have Emmeline and I have Leslie. So here's the sentence. How I kept score of a year in which I was living suddenly from my, in a year which I was flung suddenly from my own life, only to learn that to see something in its entirety is to be entirely outside of that thing. How I took one long walk around myself, how I wrote it down, the stark, inescapable facts of a situation. I think especially that sentence, how I took one long walk around myself, is something that all three of your books are really profoundly grappling with. So can you speak on that sentence in its context first?
Sure, yeah. I think, yeah, the way I thought about the book was like a walk. I was thinking about it quite literally, and there's a lot of walking in the book. Yeah, I think of a walk as a sort of daily, well, it's a necessity, but it's also just kind of a daily kind of practice or a rhythm or having a certain routine. And I think the project was written in a kind of log-based format at first. So before it became a novel, it was kind of something like a log, which I think of as pretty distinct from a journal, because I wasn't writing down feelings per se. It was more of something I was tracking, almost like a travel log, but within my home. And yeah, so I think the walk was maybe around in a kind of maybe my apartment, but also, yeah, this kind of internal walking. I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but it was kind of the way I was thinking about the book, or kind of how it became a book. Actually, it started as this log and then kind of transformed into this walk, which is literalized in certain parts of the book, also in non-literal walking.
I love your writing, and that's such a beautiful part of your book. I think for me, what that sentence kind of brings up, I guess, is like this idea of the part before the long walk around myself, the part about how to seeing something in its entirety is to be entirely outside of that thing, I think was something I was really trying to, and I think all of our books are kind of doing this in a certain way, but like I was trying to really see the stark and inescapable facts of a situation that was like a vast epidemic, but also that had very real ramifications on my individual life and the life of almost every individual that I love, and sort of trying to craft a form of narration that allowed you to both be entirely outside of the thing while also entirely inside of the thing, because which I think walking very slowly is a great metaphor for, maybe in like weird circles inside of a whirlpool. But I think it's like this, I was trying to do this sort of like narrative solidarity where I was trying to tell my story from inside other women's stories, and like through ventriloquizing their stories, I actually don't think my story is the most essential microcosm at all. And so I felt like I had to get entirely outside of that thing and get that walk around myself in order to like notice that I was actually in a beautiful room, much like this, filled with many other women with similar experiences.
Yeah, I love that you chose that sentence, and or that few sentences, and I love what both of you have said. And it's interesting because I think one of the things that I really am so drawn to in both of your books, although they do it in very different ways, is this movement between interiority or subjectivity or the first person in some way, whether that's happening in a novel or whether that's happening in the kind of limited but I think very powerful role that the first person plays in your essays, Emmeline. But moving between that sort of interior subjectivity and then this outward gaze. So there's some really powerful visceral writing in Eliza's book about the ways that hearing loss like makes the sounds of the self become overwhelmingly loud. Like there's a moment where you describe like the closing of eyelids as like the sound of a head hitting the pillow. Like, so there's this way that the self becomes sort of like almost oppressively present when the world goes away in this particular way that has to do with the world falling silent. But it feels like in relation to that like state of being in which the sound of one's own eyelids closing becomes very loud is this like deep animating curiosity and attention where we get to follow this narrator who's just like constantly kind of staying in a way like surviving by way of a kind of curiosity. I mean, surviving might be kind of a drawn from a dramatic register that's not quite the dramatic register of this book, but I think that sort of sense of like paying attention to the world as a project that's like motivated by, in some ways, like being thrown back on oneself. And then the form of Emmeline's essays is so kind of urgently and fluently moving between this lived experience of kind of disordered eating, and then all of the like, and not only like this, what you describe as like the sort of sororal ghost choir, but the all of these other voices, all of these other stories, all these other women from movies, women from books, women that you interviewed as a journalist, women you love, like it's sort of moving between your own experience and their experiences in this way that also feels like a toggling between inward and outward, but all of that is also in service of a kind of gazing at the larger outward, which is to say, this is not just about my life or your life. This is about like all the social forces that are collaborating to make us destroy ourselves in these ways. So I think that the kind of seeing something by stepping out of it, or that language of like being inside of a thing or outside of a thing, I think also really captures something about how these two books are working in and around the first person. And then in terms of my own book, I mean, I think about it in a couple different ways. Like, I certainly felt this, I mean, so Splinters is about essentially this 2-year period in my life when my daughter was very young, the first 2 years of her life, and my marriage was falling apart. And it's really about the kind of double helix of those two charged events. And so there's very much a way that part of what the book is tracking is like, you know, to see a thing entirely is to be entirely outside of it. For me, one of those things is like the family or the future that I thought would be my future, or the marriage that I thought would be my marriage, or the sort of kind of home or stability of the nuclear family as like a safe resting space where it's like to be, you know, 19 degrees in the sun with the garbage bags outside the sublet is very much like to be kind of thrown outside of what I had thought family would be, and trying to build a new way of being, trying to build a new life that was full of caregiving and full of beauty and full of, you know, all the things life is always full of, like loneliness, boredom, like love, transformation. But like it felt like this was a time where my life was essentially kind of coming unassembled, and then I was trying to assemble it again. So that sort of sense of being outside of a thing and trying to, and in that case, the thing is like, well, what can a family be if it's not going to look like this thing I thought it was going to be?
Yeah, that's so great. Okay, so my sentence from your book was it was very hard to choose, Leslie. There were a lot of sentences that I thought were so resonant and really powerful here. But there was one that I found myself repeating to almost everyone that I met. I actually talked about it today in workshop in relation to one of my student stories. And it is this sort of concept that's presented to you by a friend, our friend Harriet, this idea of living underneath the shadow of a question mark. And I think that there's a lot of different ways in which that idea is turned around in all three of your books. And I think it also sort of, in a way, it reaches toward this theme of crisis and desire as well, to live underneath this shadow of a question mark, the idea of doubting oneself, doubting the situation, seeking the sort of way out, and the desire that sort of propels one to hopefully live outside the shadow of the question mark. So could you contextualize that for us? And then I'd love to know if you feel like that's a resonant theme in your books as well.
The inescapable shadow of the question mark. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I love just like a small formal note, and then I'll get into the substance of that moment that you pointed to. But one of the ways in which I think about what Splinters is, or what I want it to be, is very much like a compendium of pieces of wisdom that other people in my life have offered me. There's a lot of the scenes in the book are scenes of conversation. I mean, the scenes that aren't me and like a 1-year-old are. So I mean, some of those are scenes of conversation too. But there are a lot of ways in which I'm trying to dramatize inside of the book, the ways in which my own psyche feels so built by the other people in my life, so kind of named by other people, so understood by other people, that the people I love and have shared my life with have given me language for what I've lived like countless times. And I wanted that to be part of the dramatic action of the book. So I was talking a couple months ago with my friend Kaveh Akbar, and he said that, he felt like something that his novel Martyr and Splinters had in common was that they were both sort of they had the shape of a commonplace book in certain ways, like you might not see it on their surfaces, but that both of them are sort of animated by this desire to like gather a lot of wisdom from other people and like put it in one home. And Harriet is one of my prime wisdom dispensers in this life, and she showed up. She's like, there are literally Harriet quotes in like all of my books for the past decade, and often it's people being like, my favorite line in this book was thing your friend Harriet said. But this moment was a moment where we were talking about kind of the fantasy of certainty, although I think I was living inside of the fantasy rather than able to label it as such. But we were walking in this park in Paris, the park that the High Line actually is designed after, on top of these old railroad tracks. And we were talking about this relationship that I was inside of with the man who would become my husband. I was talking about how good it felt to have a kind of certainty in this relationship, which was really, in a way, like a reaction against this relationship I'd been in for 4 years that was sort of it was like storm tossed in this perpetual volatility of feeling like he's my soulmate. We can't ever be together. He's my soulmate. We can't ever be together. And that all I wanted was just to be sure, And Harriet said, "Yeah, she asked me. She said, well, what is it like to not live under the shadow of the question mark? Because that can feel like such an oppressive place to live, under that shadow." And of course, when I write this scene in the book, it's less to kind of co-sign on my former self inside of this state of certainty, and more to say I was so desperate to feel certain that I convinced myself I was no longer living under the shadow of the question mark, when of course, in a way, we always are. Maybe sometimes we feel the kind of chill of that shadow more forcibly upon our backs, but even when we don't feel it, it's there in some form. So I think there's a way that one of the many arcs that kind of stretch across my book, I think, is an arc of coming to kind of wear that state of living under the question mark a little bit more comfortably, rather than kind of chasing the fantasy of getting rid of the question mark entirely.
Yeah, I think that really resonates, I think, with the narrator's experience in my project, as I think the whole book is kind of a reckoning with the heavy appearance of the question mark, and knowing that it is always there, but having it loom in a different way. And I think is ultimately an acceptance of the question mark, and a long avoidance and kind of war with it, and then a certain acceptance of it. And I think the narrator, of course, in my book, is told that she's likely going to go deaf over the course of a year, and spoiler alert, at the end she learns that she's entered a remission, and so her journey is kind of I would I would say a certain kind of avoidance of the self. And I think in that kind of journey of avoidance, she is trying to pay attention to anything but herself, and that question mark is the thing inside of herself. I think the question mark feels like a timer or time that's running out that she can hear. So I think, the question mark is just this incredibly loud thing in the book. Maybe it's clock. And I think that would be my short answer. I'll pass off to Emmeline.
I think I I really love what you said about the avoidance, the long avoidance, and then finally being like, okay, this life is giving absolute question mark. And like, I think that for me, in terms of how it appeared in my project, it's more like, I think that at first, when I was like, all right, let's write this socio-political history of eating disorders. And then I realized that sort of, I felt like there was going to be a point where I was certain, and I'd like uncovered the grand conspiracy or whatever, which I think at moments of this, there in the process and in the book are these revelatory moments of seeing these structural forces like acting in very specific ways on people that are then used as pawns. But I also found that like I found a lot of like liberatory power in the shadow of the question mark, both as like a genre question of like, I don't just have to write this one like very straightforward like historical or reported thing, like the like amorphous shadow of the question mark where like it's kind of dark and it's kind of like curvy or whatever is actually like the only place where we can be genuinely analytical almost in an honest way, which I know, Leslie, we talk about all the time of like this like facade of objectivity when you try to take the I out of writing that's meant to be like serious or whatever. But actually it's like, I don't know about you guys, but I live in a society, so I can only make my argument be smart if I admit where I'm coming from. And so I think like, I was like, I want to ask a very different set of questions than we've asked about eating disorders. And I want to pose them kind of in a different form and in a different tone and try to not fear shifting tones and these blurred edges between reportage and memoir and like social media ekphrasis or whatever it is. And so I felt like, I think, yeah, I had a lot of fear about that amorphous question mark area, but I realized that it was actually a fabulous lagoon. I'm doing too much. Let's hand it off.
I love that. Okay, so my sentence from your book, Emmeline, and I think so much of what you said really reinforces why I love this sentence, why I chose this sentence, but I also think there's something sort of liberatory in this one as well. In the prologue of your book, you say, I'm trying to row a lifeboat and write a love letter and learn to swim. Can you talk about the context that sentence comes in?
Yes, definitely. So thank you for choosing that sentence. I massively regretted not reading from the prologue when I started reading, but I was like thinking I should do something different.
I was glad because that might ruin my question. So thank you.
But no, that is great choice. I think so. That sentence comes at a point where I'm talking about sort of this kind of canonical to me and a lot of other women, like iconic figure of this sort of sexy, skinny, sad girl that is kind of wasting away and attracting a lot of adoring eyes with her kind of beautiful disappearance sort of and self-destruction that is manifested through this like incredible suppression of her appetites, of her physical appetites in service of this like in order to create this like skeletal frame that is both visibly in pain but also visibly achieving something or whatever within this society we live in. That I famously notice. And I was basically trying to say that, like, I feel like in most narratives of eating disorders or most books about eating disorders I've been able to find, either that figure of the, like, sexy, skinny, wasting away sad girl is either entirely demonized as this, like, evil, bad influence that's trying to indoctrinate other women into her, like, weird cult, or she's hugely glamorized and she's depicted in this very seductive way where you, even if it's meant as a cautionary tale, it's easy to misread as a manual and you sort of yearn for the type of attention she's getting. And the way the like warm bath of that spotlight seems like distracts us from the fact that like she's often dead at the end of the narrative. And so I was trying to say like, rather than one of these two disparate points, like disparate ways to approach her, these like demonization or glamorization, what if we said, well, like someone literally stranded her at that vanishing point and they don't want us to be able to like talk to her because then she might realize that she doesn't want to teach us her ways. She doesn't want to keep doing them. Her story might not end as well as she thinks it is. But if we keep ourselves siloed and we keep writing these very like moralistic stories, then we can't actually like hear each other and understand that the different manifestations of our eating disorders are actually like coming from a lot of the same root causes. So I was saying I'm trying to write like a love letter to someone who's been receiving a lot of hate mail from like her peers, even if she's receiving love letters that are validating the way she's killing herself from the people that want her to kill herself. I'm trying to like go save her from the stranded thing I'm doing in this long metaphor. And I was also trying to learn to swim myself through this very dangerous sea that I'd found myself in for decades, where I like didn't know if I wanted to be her or fight her or whatever.
I love that.
Could I get the sentence again? Because I just got so taken by Emmeline's reply.
It's a great sentence. I'm trying to row a lifeboat and write a love letter and learn to swim.
It's a great sentence.
Thanks, Queen.
Great sentence.
Yeah, I think that does beautifully apply. You chose great sentences. Yeah, I think the love letter comes in. I mean, the lifeboat's sort of self-explanatory, but the love letter comes in. I think the narrator is experiencing kind of this fluctuating, ongoing loss of a sense, and her kind of aliveness to other things in the world that she might not have noticed or definitely would have not noticed otherwise. Becomes radically heightened. And yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of love in the book, a love and kind of connection and searching and wanting. And that I think is also, it's in relation to others and in relation to herself. And I think going through this kind of sensory loss, of course, heightens that in some way. I've thought of the book as a kind of project of relentless exteriority, and kind of this forced looking out, again, returning to this kind of idea of avoidance of self. And I think kind of the book comes around to being this certain kind of acceptance, and that love has to do with the world and oneself in relation to it. The lifeboat is kind of just surviving the days one after the next, and the kind of experience of those days, and that also becomes love, that kind of survival, I think, for the narrator in the book.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of love that dwells or saturates the narrator's attention in your book. That kind of outwardness. It's both, maybe it's driven by a certain kind of avoidance, but it feels also like a kind of radical presence. And I love, one of the things that I love most about your book, Emmeline, is just that there is such a deep tenderness and care that radiates out towards all of these women who have been, as you just so eloquently said, like done a disservice in both their romanticization and their demonization, and even the forms of sympathy that have reduced them. And so there's a way that this kind of so much of what your book gets at so like deftly are the various forms of kind of competition and hierarchy that can kind of attach to the world of eating disorders. The ways that like bulimia is sometimes seen as a sort of second tier eating disorder for people who don't have this willpower to be anorexic. This is obviously not me stating a truth about people or disorders, but a kind of really corrosive, toxic rhetoric that you pick apart like in such necessary, powerful ways in the book. And that feels like part of the love letter of the book too, is to kind of really fight all of these, fight the impulse to pit one sort of pain against another, or put one kind of pain on top of another, and thus like offer very little care or compassion to any of the people experiencing any of the kinds of pain. My book is very much a love letter to a lot of things. I mean, the subtitle of my book is another kind of love story, and that's a story in of itself. I mean, subtitles are like the great. I've heard a little bit of your subtitle story, Emmeline. I think you landed somewhere really great. Subtitles are so often just like a fierce fight. It's like the way in which an author is being asked to like reduce their work of nonfiction to a couple of like topical bullet points or so. Or that's how it can feel, you know. So, but I ended up being really kind of. This was like one of the first times that I felt like I had a kind of transformative relationship to the subtitle process, where I was forced to put a subtitle in my book, but then it actually helped me open up the book to myself in a new way. Like when I decided to call it another kind of love story, I was like, yeah, what are the love stories in this book? And it's certainly, you know, it's certainly a love story about me and my daughter, and in that way, it is very much a love letter to her. But I also felt this kind of insistence on telling the story of my marriage as a love story too, because, you know, a thing does not have to have a happy ending to be a love story. And so I wanted to kind of claim the story of my marriage as a love story as well. It's also in a lot of ways like a love letter to, it's a love letter to friendship. It's a love letter to teaching. It's a love letter to these like, to both friendship and teaching as sort of extra familial forms of loving or sites of loving. And in lots of ways, it's like a love letter to the city. I mean, I've lived in New York and Brooklyn for a little over 10 years, and I've never really written about it before this book. And so in a lot of ways, like, this is also me writing about kind of coming alive to the city in a different way when my marriage fell apart. I felt like I needed things from the city that I hadn't needed before. I needed to feel grounded here. I needed to feel kind of in the company of strangers with a particular acuity. So that's a love letter too. And then I guess the very last thing I'll say, one of the things I love about that sentence is like, it's me trying to teach myself how to use a lifeboat and learn how to swim. And I think there's a kind of farcical quality to survival, I think, that's just like whatever it fucking takes. Like I have to learn how to row this boat, and I have to learn how to swim. And there's a moment in my book where I'm like looking at honeymooners. I'm like on Capri in Italy, and which was a very nice place to be. But I was also kind of anyway, I was feeling a little dispirited about love. But I was looking at all these honeymooners, like taking photos on their phones of the sunset and then like posting them on Instagram. And I could just remember, I was so fully in touch with a version of myself from like 10 or 15 years earlier who'd be like, these people who are on their phones with each other, like they don't know what love is. Like they're not going to make it. But in that moment, I was like, look, like, I don't know what love is, you know, like I obviously haven't managed to make it. So in that moment, I'm just like, whatever it fucking takes. Like if love for you is separately Instagramming this sunset, who am I to say you're not, you know, who am I to say that's not a durable happiness? So, you know, the rowboat or the swim, or maybe you need both.
I love that. Okay. I want to ask you guys a really quick questions about structure, and then turn it over to the audience for your questions before the book signing. So if you have a question, think of it now, and you'll have your chance in just a second. So, Emmeline, you've talked about this a little bit already. One of the things I was so struck by in your book, and specifically the structure form of your book, is the way in which you are, of course, like integrating a lot of other process materials, source materials, sociopolitical histories, and yet you're also sort of very personally and tenderly thinking about a reader like you that might be coming into this book. So one of the things that I was so struck by is like the incredible intellectual rigor of the research that's always like lying hand in hand with a tender, somewhat protective, and you're very clear to say, I'm not trying to condescend or trick this imagined reader. I love this imagined reader, but I want to protect them from the sort of possibility of being glamorized, you know, that's being glamorized or being a manual or anything like that. And I feel the sort of tension of those two aims, what we may call like audience and tradition, throughout the whole book in such a startlingly like alive way. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about that tension and how you manage the balance between those two things.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying all that. That's very kind. Yeah, I mean, it was definitely like people with eating disorders have just been like mocked and maligned and condescended to. And like, you know, I just was I was motivated by this combination of sort of rage and compassion, right? To be like, okay, well, the literal medical journals have been making you people making us sound insane and also like dumb and superficial and like simple, right? And then the mainstream media accounts have been making us look vain and crazy and catty and whatever. And so I want to both demonstrate the ways that all of those narratives are serving to uphold this like larger capitalist power structure that wants us all to have eating disorders. Because if we're all like getting mad at each other and being afraid that somebody else is going to get each other sick or whatever, then we're not going to notice who actually wants us to be sick, right? And so, but I also didn't want to be instructional in the way that so many of these books have been, where I sort of felt like I was walking this line where like there's a lot of talk these days about like fear of triggering people, right? And I think that with eating disorders specifically, the like emphatic way people will talk about like, or like even when I've like tried to like excerpt this or like deal with it in other ways, like when people are so afraid that you're going to trigger someone. And I think that that actually contributes to a culture of silence around eating disorders, and the fact that there's a dominant narrative of eating disorders is this very linear narrative that features this one very thin girl that eating disorder manifests in a very specific way. And she had to like realize that she had body dysmorphia and that she wasn't actually fat, and then she can now recover, which is in itself a very fat phobic narrative. It's all very limited. And I think that in our like the fear of triggering ends up reinforcing that weirdly linear narrative, because then we can't tell these like much more complicated stories about eating disorders that might not follow such a clear-cut linear trajectory, and at the same time sort of infantilize women and underestimate their intellect and their strength. Like, a girl that's had an eating disorder for years isn't going to be triggered by someone else being like, I had one too. That's just because you don't want her to talk about it. On the other hand, something that like so many of these memoirs have done historically is like give way too much like numerical information about both pounds and about calories and stuff. And it's like, I didn't find it even hard at all to take out the stuff that might not be triggering but might be instructive. It didn't feel difficult to take that stuff out, because this wasn't really, if it's a story about numbers at all, it's about like dollar signs, not about calorie counts. And so there was all of that. And then there was also just like really trying to balancing this like tonal approach and this kind of, I wanted to channel pain in the way that I've seen women experience pain, and the ways that so many women writers I know and deeply admire, their work has been dismissed because it's too overly emotional or whatever. And I feel like I would be doing a disservice, even if it allowed the work to reach a wider audience, it would be doing a disservice to the reader who I know it's going to mean the most to, and to the writers who I have admired the most, if I tried to modulate that tone and not be like, I can be talking in this like post-purge, acerbic, sarcasm, rasp, but like giving you statistics and doing philosophy like at the same time, and it doesn't undercut the point. And if I quote a tweet right after I quote a philosopher, like, you're misogynistic if you think that's dumb. Like, I don't know. So it was kind of like that, and I'm getting worked up, and somebody else can talk.
That's amazing. Okay, Eliza, I feel like, and Leslie actually spoke briefly to this a little bit, I felt like one of the things I was most struck by in your book were what I just sort of kept thinking of, like the sensory textures of everyday life. And I mean that in the sense of like our actual sensorial perception, but also just like a sensory like attunement to things like the mysteries of our neighbors or our friends or our exes. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like creating that texture. And I think specifically like the thing that I felt that was so particular about this texture is that you as a writer, but then also us as a reader, are drawn into like the necessity of being startlingly present. That's like kind of the only way to make something like that. And so I wonder if you could talk about that sort of commitment to sort of the startling presence of your book?
Yeah, I think the book does dovetail with events of my own life. And I think there are many parts of the kind of log of the book, which was the kind of foundation of the text, that were written in a present tense. And you talked about the moment of the eyelids and the blinking. There was a period of time when, I could feel and hear every blink. It was almost like pressure. And so I think there is a kind of year of my life when I wasn't writing a book and I was just keeping a log. And there are some sentences that are in this book that I don't think could have been written after the fact. And there's a kind of presentness to the sensory elements of the experience. And that's actually the part of the book that feels not that genre matters, but that's the non-fictional part. I really feel is like the sensory part, and that was really written in a kind of real-time log-like or travel log around oneself kind of moment. And I think it's strange to think about not being able to access that part of myself anymore. Part of where the book came from. And I think, so being kind of alive to certain things, I think, or being aware of certain things in certain moments, how these channels in ourselves open and close at different periods of our lives. Thinking about that in relation to Leslie's book too, when you just are inside of an experience, and then you can be outside of it and take the walk, I guess. Maybe they happen at the same time, but they're two different things. But there's the sensory part was maybe one Eliza, and the walk was another Eliza. And so, I think that part was written in a real kind of daily kind of presence with oneself that was kind of claustrophobic and inescapable, and did feel like things were shutting kind of in.
Yeah, okay, so my last question before we turn it over to the audience, and you sort of set me up so nicely talking about one Eliza and another Eliza. One thing that I'm so struck by in your book is in Splinters is that it's in no way tethered to some sort of sense of like strict chronology, right? The book really moves in time and in sort of estimation of circumstances in such an extraordinary way. And I'm sure that I'm saying this partially because I'm influenced by a knowledge of the class that you're teaching right now about the self, but I feel, of course, in these splinters that we encounter that there's sort of a constant allegiance to grappling or wrestling with the many selves, not just the narrator's self, the Leslie self, but other people's many selves. And I think part of that is also like there's a drumbeat of a question that I feel like undergirds the whole structure of the book, which is like, how do we love and have compassion for the previous selves that have put us in situations that now are very challenging to navigate, both for us and the previous selves of other people. So that felt like an organizing principle in the book. I wonder if you should speak to that.
I love that phrase, the drumbeat of a question. I do have a couple things I'll say, but I'll keep it brief so that we can open it up to a few questions from all of you. I mean, I think one of the things that felt really liberating and generative to me about the form of these splinters, which it's not like it's a form that I invented in any way. Like people have been writing in fragmented ways as long as people have been writing at all. But by splinters, I just mean these like short units of prose, like anywhere from a paragraph to my friend Roger Reeves, the poet in Austin, counted. He was like, they go up to 5 paragraphs. Like he had gotten very technical about it. I appreciated that. But they're short units of prose, and it allows, as you say, it allows me to move around in time. It allows me to move around within the chronology of my relationship, but also into the deeper past, into my childhood and the ways where times and moments in my life where I was learning, like, or getting these visions of like what love could be, or what marriage was, or what a divorce could be, or how parents care for children, or how a mother is both a caregiver and lives a full life beyond her caregiving, so something about this short form really allowed me to move around in time, and it also it gave me a formal way to do this kind of reckoning that you're describing, with wanting myself to be multiple on the page and wanting other people to be multiple on the page. So in these kind of slivers of prose allowed me to give you the kind of whiplash or vertigo of going from, changing my daughter's diaper like behind a street lamp to, getting up in front of a crowd with a microphone, and like you just see those glimpses like a 1-2 punch, and the kind of rhythms of the prose allowed me to kind of recreate some version of that vertigo. But it also allowed me to like allow other people to be multiple, to show you somebody in a difficult moment and also in a really beautiful and tender moment, because that is the mystery of ourselves and other people to me, how we hold these kind of impossibly tender, deeply compelling facets alongside our worst moments and our worst tendencies and the ways we cause harm. So I think that was something that, there are many, many, many different forms that can allow you to evoke that multiplicity, but here the short form sort of let me do it. So
That's incredible. Okay, we just have to give you a round of applause. Woo! Okay. So we have time just for maybe a few short questions. Yeah.
First, I want to say I'm in awe of you ladies. I'm going to say I'm in awe of all three of you. Leslie, I read your book, which is why I'm here. I was obsessed with it and loved it. And now I'm going to read both of yours. I have an easy question. Are you still in the apartment owned by the artist?
That's a loaded question right now. I am.
Okay, then. But thank you all.
The narrator is also there.
The narrator is there.
Yeah. Someone else? Yeah. Good.
Hi. Ooh. This is a question for Emmeline and Eliza. So I feel like we heard this description of your wonderful pandemic Zoom workshop and this sort of special space that you were all sharing. I'm curious about the process in both of your writing projects, sort of post MFA, but pre-book deal. Like, how did leaving that shared space and sort of turning to your books on your own change your projects?
I think that's a really good question. It definitely, one thing about the workshop that was fabulous is that I just think I probably would not have had the internal confidence to believe the project was worth continuing to turn to on my own if it hadn't been clear that like other people who I respected and whose work I respected were connecting with it, and if I hadn't had like so much amazing guidance from Leslie as well as like support and belief in the project. So I think that was sort of like the bedrock, but I do think that like even like I think to create enough pages quickly enough to like finish a project, at least for me, I actually can't be showing it to that many people in bits. So like it was really helpful to have like a few essays I was really working on in that workshop, but then be like, okay, now you can like you can now write like 100 pages and show those all at once to somebody else or something. So I think it allowed me to kind of zero in on the vision and really do the structure, because I think sometimes when you're in the workshop settings, you can get really blinded to the like internal structure of the internal chapters and not see the thing as a whole. So I think that for me, it was like pivoting to like looking at it from like a bird's eye view instead of from like each individual like chapter view. And then in terms of process, I wrote it. I just wrote it. But I did a lot of research and then I wrote it. That's really stupid. Eliza, do better.
I also want to echo what Emmeline said about just kind of the kind of immense gratitude that I have for this workshop, for Leslie's workshop. it's not hyperbole to say that I really don't think the book would exist without it. There might be something else might have existed, but not this book. And I'm so grateful. I could cry actually thinking about our workshop.
I'm gonna cry right after this.
And yeah, the book was written at the point of the workshop. It existed as these kind of like tiles that were titled sections, written in kind of splinters, titled splinters. And yeah, and it had kind of lived a life as a thesis, as my graduate thesis. And then in that kind of 6 months following, I kind of wrote into the cracks of the tiles. And that's kind of where more of the narrative and the fiction emerged from the text. So that's kind of where I took the project after kind of grout phase. Caulking. Exactly.
You had a question earlier? Did you?
Hi, I'm Claire. Nice to meet you all. Leslie, I know your work started with a novel, The Gin Closet. And Eliza, I'm assuming you started a nonfiction workshop when you were generating what became your novel. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about form, novel versus nonfiction, and tying actually into something Emmeline was saying about legitimacy of narratives around eating disorders. I think about that a lot. I'm working on a novel about shopping addiction, and we have so many gambling stories and alcoholism stories that are very elevated in the culture, but it's a sort of feminized thing that lives in memoir for the time being. And anyway, just riff on that if you could. Thank you.
I'll start with fiction, nonfiction. Sure, yeah. I had a kind of funny journey. I entered the MFA program in the fiction concentration, and then I kind of met this really wonderful group of people in nonfiction, and I kind of jumped into team nonfiction, though I kept on writing fiction. So I was experiencing genre trouble, as I refer to it. And I think I wasn't really concerned with genre. Parts of the project began as essays. And again, I was thinking in terms of these like modular tiles, not in terms of narrative. So these kind of almost prose poem size bites that were titled. And it's funny, I haven't talked about this, but the book actually there are still those titles. They're there, but I just changed them to white before I sent them out so they're ghosts in the text for me, because they became this kind of organizing principle. But yeah, some of the tiles were fiction and some were nonfiction, and troubled in relation to the text, I guess.
Well, I think you should definitely write a book about shopholism. It sounds amazing. There's a book that Leslie and I are obsessed with called Appetites by Caroline Knapp, and she talks about I think it's largely not widely read because it kind of troubles the forms of how we think of nonfiction genres, because it's some memoir about her anorexia, but it's mostly like hugely reported and like sociological work on like shopaholism and on eating disorders and on alcoholism, just on like these like sort of feminized yearning struggles. But I think the questions of legitimacy as it regards genre are, I think, just designed to keep literature kind of boring, because it's just so much more interesting to mix it up. I just think also it just it can be, you can come to new conclusions when you're not letting the genre category and the things you've read before feel like the only way to come to a conclusion. And then that can actually change the conclusion that you come to.
I mean, I'll just say, I love talking about genre. And I was when I was in an MFA program now almost 2 decades ago. I was writing fiction. I was in a fiction program, and my first book was a novel. To Diana's question, actually, a little while back, it was the leaving workshop was an important part of my own creative life cycle, because I think I was writing short stories when I was in workshop, and one of them was good. It was okay. But then I really needed to like leave the kind of sometimes benevolent, sometimes not benevolent panopticon of workshop to write a novel. That was just like, I needed to be doing something kind of a little bit more in secret for a while. And for me, there are certain ways in which I do really care about the difference between fiction and nonfiction. Like, when I'm writing a reported piece for the New Yorker, like, I am very grateful for the fact checker who's talking to my sources and making sure I like got things right about their lives and their struggles. Like, that's an important contract to me between a writer and their subjects and a writer and their readers. Like, if a piece is presented that way, that it be non-fictional in that way. But in lots of other ways, I really don't. Like, I have like 1,000 different soapboxes I can stand on this, but I think for me, fiction and nonfiction are like, when I write them, they're asking the same questions. Like, what does it feel like to be alive? Like, what does intimacy mean with other people? Like, how do we almost destroy ourselves? Like, how are we individuals within larger social structures? Like, how, like, what's the relationship between a body and the spirit that lives in that body? Like, it's like, yeah, so you can write into those questions in fiction or not, but so much of the work I've done, and like I'm now writing a novel again, like so much of the work of writing fiction feels like the craft questions are so shared. Like, how do you create a character who is like multiple and kind of contradictory and like allowed to have like many aspects that point in different directions? Like, that work feels so kind of not just craft-wise, but ethically or spiritually shared, whether you're creating a fictional character or trying to write a version of somebody who has lived in the actual world as well. So I think, and I'm so many of my feelings about kind of ordinariness as like a site of profundity are also like, kind of end up coming up against this feeling of indignation that like in the realm of literary fiction, for example, it's like well understood that the ordinary life is like a great subject of profundity. Like, Ulysses is an ordinary man taking a walk around his own life in Dublin, but like in nonfiction, we don't have this understanding at all. It's like, well, you didn't hurt bad enough, or you think you hurt the worst, and that's why you wrote about your own life. It's like, no. Actually, I wrote about my life because I think any life, holds that meaning. So I think there are all kinds of interesting kind of confluences and conversations between genres. I'm glad you asked about it.
We're a little over time, so but my guess is that these very generous authors would answer other questions like in a book signing line. And so if we can do that, but I would just like to say just such a huge thank you to everyone here for coming, and of course...
And thank you, Chloe, for asking these questions.
Thank you so much, Chloe. You were an incredible moderator.
Thank you so much.